有人認為由美國主導嘅世界秩序將會成為過去，亞洲迅速發展，因此將21世紀稱為亞洲世紀。新加坡著名外交官 Kishore Mahbubani 馬凱碩，亦都係亞洲世紀呢個說法嘅主要推手之一。佢喺2000年代初曾經出任過聯合國安理會主席，亦都出版過多本膾炙人口嘅書籍。仲有唔夠2個月時間，美國就會舉行總統大選，將會係今年國際政治嘅壓軸重頭戲。到底美國人要揀返特朗普，定係破天荒揀一個黑人女性賀錦麗呢？對於中美關係嘅影響又會係點呢？
Your recent interview with media, you referred to yourself as a China optimist. Some people may think that you are even more confident in China than the Chinese themselves. And indeed, we can see that the Chinese economy is not doing quite well right now. It's still like we are still struggling to recover from COVID-19. And generally, there is a growing pessimism in the society. So what makes you feel optimistic about China?
Well, I think there's no question that business sentiment is down in China. That businessmen feel that there aren't much growth prospects for them domestically, and certainly the bursting of the real estate bubble has clearly had a depressing effect on the Chinese economy. But you also got to remember that the Chinese economy did grow by 5% in 2023. For an economy of that size, it grew faster than United States, and certainly grew better than the European Union countries, and for many countries in the world. So, and if you look at China's manufacturing exports, they have continued to grow in the world. And if you look at China's scientific and technological development, it still continues to grow very positively. In fact, even The Economist, a magazine that in the UK that is super critical of China, came out with a cover story saying that China has succeeded in its science and technological development. So if you don't look at the short term and look at the long-term trends, and these long-term trends of China are still positive.
So we have to stay positive and be persistent.
Yeah, well, I think at the end of the day, I mean, there are ways and means certainly in which China can improve the management of its economy. It's got to take care of the real estate bubble in some ways more effectively. But the overall trend of positive growth hasn't changed in the Chinese economy.
I think you have also stressed that actually the United States can never be underestimated. So as you are optimistic about China, are you also optimistic about US? Since we can see that the United States is deeply divided. You can tell by the presidential candidate that they have chosen.
Well, I mean, in my book, Has China Won, which has been published in Chinese, I emphasize that it would be a huge mistake to underestimate the United States of America. In fact, in my chapter 1 of my book, Has China Won, I have a fictional memo that has been written to President Xi Jinping by one of his colleagues. It's fictional, saying, of course, China will win the contest against the United States, but China must never underestimate the United States of America. And the United States of America has got some structural advantages. So, for example, even though what you see is a lot of chaos in the United States, political chaos, that political chaos creates a lot of contestation. And if you have a lot of contestations, when animals fight each other, they become stronger. So the Americans become stronger as a result of fighting each other all the time. And this contestation and competition is making Americans strong. And that's why America produces amazing companies. And the second structural advantage United States of America has, is that it can get talent not just from 330 million Americans, it can get talent from 8 billion people in the world. So some of America's biggest companies like Microsoft and Google are run by people who are not born in the United States. Microsoft is run by Satya Nadella, who was born in India, and Google is led by Sundar Pichai, who was also born in India. So you can see, therefore, that the United States has got amazing access to global talent. And in addition to all this means that the United States still has a culture of innovation that is quite remarkable.
So before we move on to talk about Asia, and I would like to ask one more question on US and China. Because we all know that Joe Biden asserts the 21st century as a contest between democracy and autocracy. So, however, we can see that more and more countries, especially from the global south, actually they recognize China's achievement, especially in terms of the governance of Chinese. So, one question is, can China's governance capabilities absorb it of the original sin of autocracy? Or in other words, how can China shake off such labels?
Well, I mean, the reason why President Joe Biden describes it as a contest between democracy and authoritarianism is that he's got to find a way of justifying to the American people why the United States is taking on the burden of launching this contest against China. Now, it is going to be expensive for the United States. It's going to be difficult. The United States will have to pay some price for this. So you got to win over the support of the people, because otherwise the people will say, why are you trying to bring down China? How does that help me, right? So you got to say that it's a contest between the good guys in democracy and the bad guys in authoritarianism. But it's important to emphasize that black and white view, whereby America is white and democratic and China is black and authoritarian, is not shared by the rest of the world. In fact, most countries in the global south are actually genuinely admirers of China's incredible track record in improving the standard of living of its people, in creating a gleaming new infrastructure, in developing a powerful space program, and in overall showing breakthroughs in science and technology that only one other country can match, which is the United States. So the rest of the world often says, we wish that our country could develop as well as China has developed, because if they could, our people will be far better off. So I think it's a mistake for the United States to believe that the rest of the world disapproves of China in the same way that the United States and the Anglo-Saxon countries disapprove of China. A lot of my writings is intended to educate the American public, to tell them, why don't you look at China, for example, through the eyes of the other countries in the world, and certainly the ASEAN countries in the world all want to be friends with the United States, and they want to be friends with China too.
21世紀已經過咗接近1/4啦，亞洲國家嘅經濟表現依然亮麗，但係一場新冠疫情凸顯咗東西方治理模式嘅唔同。如果自由民主唔係歷史嘅終結，咁亞洲或者東亞嘅治理模式，未來可唔可以吸引到更加多嘅發展中國家仿效呢？
So I would like to move on to the part we can talk about the Asian century. Asian century is one of the most famous theory of yours, and you have consistently warned about the risk of war in Asia, and among various potential flashpoint that would trigger a war between U.S. and China, your answer has been the Taiwan Strait, if I got it right. So in your view, how can peace be maintained in the Taiwan Strait? And does it matter who will be the next U.S. president?
Well, I think in the most dangerous place most dangerous area in US-China relations is the Taiwan Straits. Because there's no question that if Taiwan declares independence as a country, there'll be war, right? Therefore, if you want to preserve the peace, it's actually very easy. All countries in the world, especially the United States, should reaffirm their one China policy and say that Taiwan and China are one country, right?
However, do you think that even though they are like talking about one China policy, they are acting in a different way?
Well, certainly there have been various moves made by some parties that seem to be undermining the one China policy, like for example the visit of Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, to Taiwan was dangerous and provocative and unnecessary, you know. And so those kinds of moves are very dangerous. So equally dangerous was a speech given by Mike Pompeo when he stepped down as Secretary of State after serving in the Trump administration. He said that Taiwan, the United States should recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Now, Mike Pompeo is a very intelligent, sophisticated person. He knows that this can lead to war. So it's very irresponsible for him to give that speech, which he did. And to me, what surprised me is that very few Americans criticize him for recommending something that could lead to war in the Taiwan Straits, you know. But we in Asia, the rest of the countries in Asia, since we know the dangers of war in the Taiwan Straits, we should speak out and call upon all the parties to preserve the status quo in the Taiwan Straits and not change it in any significant way. And I hope that if Donald Trump comes back or if Kamala Harris wins, both of them will the first thing they should do is to reiterate the one China policy.
And we also see another risk of war in Asia is the South China Sea, because we see that the conflicts between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea has been like quite frequent lately. And you have previously said that the Philippines' inconsistency in their China policy is dangerous. However, from the China's point of view, this kind of inconsistency may be good. I mean, since they can wait for a regime change in the Philippines. What's your evaluation on the risk of the South China Sea?
Well, I think so far, as you know, there have been no major wars in the South China Sea. And even though China has got disputes with 4 countries in ASEAN, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Philippines, most of the time there have been no incidents. And I hope that the Philippines will actually work out a consistent long-term policy for managing its relations with China, because most of the countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, have a consistent policy. So we say we want to be friends with the US, we want to be friends with China, and we maintain that. So we don't carry out any actions that will provoke either United States or provoke China. In the case of the Philippines, unfortunately, their presidents have switched. So President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was closer to China in some ways. President Aquino was closer to the United States. President Duterte was closer to China. And then now President Marcos appears to be closer to the United States. And it's not good for a country like the Philippines to have a policy that swings. Because on matters of geopolitics, it's important to get bipartisan support, get support from both parties, and at the same time have a consistent long-term policy that doesn't change. And that's what the other ASEAN countries are doing. And I hope that over time, Philippines will also achieve that.
And you have said that the 21st century is the Asia century. So we are already a quarter of the way through it. We can see a significant gap of development across Asia, with East Asia leading the way and Southeast Asia is making significant progress. But we can see that like South Asia is still struggling sometimes. So as Asia has like benefited so much at the age of globalization, What do you think is the biggest challenge for Asia to rise, especially like the myth of de-globalization is hanging around?
Well, I think, it's important to emphasize that the whole world is preparing for the Asian century. And I got an informal indication of this when I launched my book, The Asian 21st Century, as a free book. It's an open access e-book. You can download it for free. And when I met the German publisher, Springer Nature, I asked them, how many downloads do you expect of this book? And they said, if you get 20,000 downloads, it's a very good result. Now, instead of 20,000 downloads, there have been 3.6 million downloads in 160 countries. So I mentioned that the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century, and economic power has shifted certainly to China and Southeast Asia and to India. So for example, in 1980, the combined GDP of the European Union countries was 8 times bigger than China. 8 times bigger, 1980. Now China and Europe are about the same size. And by 2050, China will be twice the size of Europe. So Europe has gone from being 8 times bigger than China to becoming half the size of China. That is a shift of power to Asia. And even among the ASEAN countries, they have grown significantly. I mean, if you compare ASEAN and Japan, in the year 2000, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. It was 8 times bigger than ASEAN. Now it's about 1.3 times bigger than ASEAN. And by 2030, ASEAN will be bigger than Japan. So you see, ASEAN was supposed to be this group of poor developing countries, but they have done very well. So in many parts, an Indian economy is also now the fastest growing major economy in the world. It can grow at 7-8%. So this is why everybody believes that the 21st century will be the Asian century. But of course, we shouldn't be complacent. There could be problems, there could be challenges, and if we get overconfident, then we could falter, we could stumble. So it's very important, therefore, that the Asian countries continue to remain focused and disciplined in keeping their economic growth going.
Could you give us suggestion on how the Asian countries overcome the challenges of de-globalization?
Well, I think de-globalization is not happening completely. If de-globalization was happening, global trade would go down. Now, global trade has stagnated, hasn't gone up in the way that it has used to go in the past, but it hasn't gone down. And the good news is that Asia is growing very large middle-class populations. There's one statistic your listeners should know. If you add up the population of China, India, and ASEAN, it comes to 3.5 billion people. Now, among these 3.5 billion people, only about 150 million people enjoyed middle-class living standards in the year 2000. But by 2020, the number had exploded to 1.5 billion out of 3.5 billion. And then by 2030, the number could become 2.5 to 3 billion. So you can see the middle-class population exploding. This middle-class population is going to have demands for all kinds of consumer products. And these consumer products cannot be manufactured just in this region. So there's no fundamental deglobalization happening. There is a slowing down of globalization, but there, as far as I can tell so far, no deglobalization yet.
So the next part, I would like to ask more about the Eastern and the Western values, because I think you point out that during the COVID-19, the pandemic, the Western society actually emphasized more on freedom, liberty, rights, and the Eastern society focuses more on responsibility. That's why people are wearing masks, willing to go isolated. So that actually demonstrated a better governance, which led to a significantly better outcome of fighting the pandemic. So do you think this kind of difference in value will result in a very distinctive development paths between the East and the West, that potentially causing international conflicts?
Well, I think clearly the values of Asian societies are different from those of Western societies. So certainly in Asian societies, families tend to take care of each other and provide support to each other. But neither the Western values are superior, nor the Asian values are superior. The reason why I talk of Asian values is that the West used to proclaim that Western values are superior, they are better, and that Asians would become like the West, right? And this is what was predicted by Francis Fukuyama in his famous essay, The End of History, in around 1990, where he said that the whole world is going to become replicas of liberal democratic societies, but that hasn't happened. So instead, what's happening is that you're having a much more diverse world, and countries are keeping their values. So for example, most Islamic societies have values that are very, very different from Western societies. And I think it's wrong for the West to say to the Islamic societies that your values are wrong and my values are right. Every society has got to work out their own values, and of course change and adapt with the times. But we must make our own choices, and we should not be forced to accept Western values as superior values.